The wind screamed across the hills of northern Colorado like a living thing, rattling the tall windows of Blackthorn Manor and shaking the iron lanterns that hung beside its great wooden doors. Inside the dark study, Duke Alexander Blackthorn stood alone, staring out at the rolling land that belonged to him as far as the eye could see. The sky was heavy with storm clouds, and the wide fields below looked cold and empty. The house behind him felt even emptier. At 34, Alexander had everything most men dreamed of. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with quiet authority. His dark hair was thick, but streaked with early silver near his temples, and his eyes were a deep gray that seemed to hold back unspoken thoughts. In another life, he would have been the most desired bachelor in all of Colorado. Wealth, land, the influence, and a respected family name followed him wherever he went. But people did not follow him anymore. A long scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw. It was pale and sharp against his skin, a reminder of the carriage accident 5 years earlier that had taken his young wife, Eleanor. He had survived. She had not. Since that day, Alexander had withdrawn from society. He rarely left his estate. He hosted no gatherings. He trusted only a handful of loyal servants who had stayed through the years of silence that followed her death. The house had grown quiet. Too quiet. "Your Grace," came the careful voice of his secretary, Mr. Collins, from the doorway. "The morning mail has arrived. There are replies." Alexander turned slowly from the window. 3 months ago, in a moment of deep loneliness, yet he had placed a small advertisement in several respectable newspapers across the country. He had not signed his full name. He had used only his initials and a post office box in Denver. In the advertisement, he had written plainly that he sought a wife not for wealth or status, but for companionship. He had written that he valued kindness, intelligence, and a quiet spirit. He had not mentioned the scar. He had not mentioned the grief. "How many?" he asked calmly as he took his seat behind the large oak desk. "8 letters, Your Grace," Mr. Collins replied. 3 appear very interested in your financial situation. 2 ask directly about your holdings. 1 seems bold in her expectations. Alexander gave a faint smile that did not reach his eyes. "And the others?" "There is one in particular," Mr. Collins said gently, at placing a simple cream-colored envelope on top of the stack. "This one feels different." Alexander picked it up. The handwriting was neat, but not fancy. The paper was good quality, though not expensive. He opened it carefully and began to read. "Dear Sir, I never imagined I would answer such an unusual request, yet something in your words felt honest. You spoke of loneliness not with self-pity, but with truth. I know that feeling well. My name is Miss Clara Bennett. I am 26 years old and live in a small town outside St. Louis. My father passed away this spring after a long illness. I have no brothers or sisters, and the house we shared has been sold to cover his debts. I have some education, a steady nature, and experience managing a household. I do not seek romance like in the novels. I seek partnership, respect, and a quiet life with purpose. If you are sincere, then I am willing to continue this correspondence with honesty. Respectfully, Clara Bennett." Alexander read the letter twice. There was no flattery, no greed, no dramatic language, only calm honesty. For the first time in years, something stirred inside him. The letters continued over the following weeks. Clara wrote of her love for reading, of tending small gardens, of caring for her father during his illness. She spoke of hardship without bitterness. She asked thoughtful questions about his land, about the people who worked for him, about what he hoped for in the future. In return, Alexander found himself writing more openly than he had expected. He told her about Blackthorn Manor, about the wide ranch lands and the tenants who depended on him. And he spoke of improving irrigation systems and building better homes for workers. He admitted to feeling isolated, though he did not yet reveal why. One letter changed everything. "You once wrote that you feel as if you watch life from behind a window," Clara wrote. "I understand that. Since my father's passing, I sometimes feel as though the world continues without me. Perhaps two people standing outside the glass could open the door together." Alexander folded that letter carefully and kept it in his desk. After 2 months, he made a bold decision. In his next letter, he revealed his true identity. He was not simply a ranch owner. He was the Duke of Blackthorn. He invited Clara, along with several other ladies he had corresponded with, to visit his estate for a small gathering. They would meet in person and decide their futures honestly. The responses arrived quickly. Some were excited, some nervous. Clara's acceptance was steady, but thoughtful. She would travel with only her maid. She had no family left to accompany her. Now, 3 days before the first carriage was expected, Alexander stood again at the tall window, his stomach tight. What would they see when they arrived? Blackthorn Manor was not gentle or welcoming. Built from dark stone in the late 1800s by his grandfather, it stood tall against the open plains, with narrow towers and iron gates. The halls inside were lined with portraits of stern ancestors. Suits of armor stood in corners. Heavy tapestries covered cold walls. The house carried history like a weight. The first carriage arrived on a gray October morning. From his window, Alexander watched a young woman step down, dressed in the latest fashion from New York. She looked up at the dark towers of the manor. Her smile vanished. Within minutes, she was arguing with her driver. 10 minutes later, her carriage rolled back down the drive without her ever stepping inside. The second lady lasted longer. Miss Evelyn Harper entered the great hall, glanced at Alexander's scar, gasped, and fainted. When she recovered, she claimed sudden illness and demanded to return home at once. The third lady forced politeness for an hour. She spoke kindly, but her eyes betrayed her fear. By morning, she too was gone. With each departure, the house grew heavier. By late afternoon, Alexander had retreated to his study with a glass of whiskey and the quiet belief that this had been foolish. Perhaps he was meant to live alone among his ghosts. A knock sounded at his door. "Your Grace," said Mrs. Whitaker, the housekeeper. "The final guest has arrived, Miss Bennet." Alexander froze. "She is still here?" "Yes, Your Grace. She requested tea in the library. She has been admiring the book collection." He set down his glass slowly. Clara Bennet was still here. He straightened his coat and walked through the dim corridors toward the library. His footsteps echoed softly on the stone floor. When he entered, he saw her standing near the tall shelves, a book in her hand. She turned at the sound of the door. She was not the kind of beauty that made people stare in ballrooms. She was tall and graceful, with warm brown hair pulled back neatly. Her hazel eyes were clear and steady. Her dress was simple, but well made. Most striking of all was her expression. She did not flinch, yet she did not stare at his scar with shock or disgust. She looked at him calmly, as if she had expected exactly what she saw. "Your Grace," she said with a proper but relaxed curtsy. "Thank you for inviting me." Alexander studied her carefully. "Miss Bennet, I am surprised you chose to stay." She smiled slightly. "It is certainly an impressive home. I imagine it has frightened many." "It has," he replied honestly. "And my appearance has not helped." Her gaze moved briefly to his scar. There was no pity in her eyes, only understanding. "You were injured," she said softly, "and you survived." The simple statement struck him harder than any dramatic reaction could have. "My wife died in the accident," he said quietly. The words had not left his lips to a stranger in 5 years. "I am sorry," Clara replied. Her voice carried real compassion. "Grief changes a house. It changes a person. But it does not end a life unless we let it." They sat near the fireplace. The wind outside continued to howl, but inside the library something shifted. "Why did you stay?" he asked finally. "When others fled." Clara met his gaze without hesitation. "Because I came to meet the man who wrote those letters, the man who cares about his people and speaks honestly about loneliness. That man is still here. I see him." For the first time in years, Alexander felt the tight hold around his heart loosen slightly. She had chosen to stay, and for the first time since the accident, hope stepped quietly into Blackthorn Manor. The next morning dawned clear and bright over the wide Colorado plains. Sunlight spilled across the hills and touched the dark stone of Blackthorn Manor, softening its sharp edges. For the first time in years, Alexander did not wake with a heavy feeling in his chest. He dressed carefully, choosing a dark coat that fit him well, smoothing his silver-streaked hair with more attention than usual. He told himself it did not matter. Yet it did. When he entered the breakfast room, Clara was already there, seated near the tall windows with a cup of tea in her hands. Morning light warmed her face. She looked peaceful, and as if she belonged in that room. "Good morning, Your Grace," she said with a gentle smile. "Alexander," he replied quietly. "When we are alone, you may call me Alexander." She nodded. "Then, good morning, Alexander." They shared breakfast with easy conversation. Clara asked about the land, about the workers who lived in small cottages beyond the hills. She listened with real interest as he explained the challenges of drought seasons and cattle losses. "You care about them," she observed. "They depend on me," he answered simply. "And you depend on them," she added softly. He had not thought of it that way before. After breakfast, he offered to show her the grounds. They walked through long corridors lined with portraits of stern men and serious women. Clara paused before one painting of his late wife Eleanor. That the portrait showed a bright young woman with kind eyes and a hopeful smile. "She was beautiful," Clara said gently. "She was light," Alexander replied. "She filled this house with warmth." "And when she died?" Clara asked carefully. "Did you try to keep everything the same?" He hesitated. "Yes." Clara studied the painting a moment longer. "Sometimes holding on too tightly keeps the past from resting peacefully." Her words stayed with him as they stepped outside. The gardens had once been Eleanor's pride. Now they were overgrown. Rose bushes climbed wildly over broken trellises. Stone paths were hidden beneath weeds. The fountain at the center no longer ran. Alexander felt a familiar sting of guilt. "I could not bear to change it," he admitted. She had plans to restore everything. Clara walked slowly through the tangled roses. What instead of disappointment, her eyes filled with quiet wonder. "It is not ruined," she said. "It is waiting." He looked at her. "With care," she continued, "it could bloom again, not as it was, but as something new." They walked farther until they reached a hill that overlooked the valley. The land stretched wide and open under the blue sky. Wind lifted strands of Clara's hair. "It is beautiful," she whispered. "It can be harsh," he warned. "So can life," she replied. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Alexander asked the question that had lingered in his mind since her arrival. "If this does not work," he said carefully, "what will you do?" Clara's hands folded calmly in front of her. I have little money left. I would seek work as a governess or companion. I would manage. You deserve more than to simply manage, he said. She turned to face him fully. I do not expect romance like in novels. I expect honesty, stability, respect. If those can grow into something deeper, then I would welcome it. And if I am not ready, he asked, then I would rather know now, she said gently. I do not fear scars, Alexander. I fear living beside someone who refuses to step back into the light. Her honesty struck him deeply. I am lonely, he admitted. Painfully so. I do not know if I can love again the way I once did. I am lonely too, she replied. Perhaps love does not need to look the same each time. The wind moved around them. Something steady passed between them in that quiet moment. That evening, they dined together in the smaller dining room. Their conversation flowed more easily than before. Clara spoke of books she loved, of teaching children to read, of the quiet joy she found in simple routines. Later, in the library, she ran her fingers gently along the spines of his books. You have not used this room much, she observed. No, you should, she said softly. A house should breathe. Days passed quickly. Clara remained. She spoke kindly to the servants. She listened to Mrs. Whitaker with interest about household matters. She visited the cottages of workers and asked thoughtful questions about their children. Alexander watched the way people responded to her. They relaxed around her, smiled more. He began to see his estate differently, not as a burden, not as a monument to grief, but as a living place. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, and he found Clara standing near the silent fountain. Miss Bennet, he said quietly. She turned, her eyes warm. I must ask you something directly, he continued. If I were to ask you to stay, not just as a guest, but as my wife, what would you say? She did not answer at once. She studied his face carefully, as if searching for doubt. Are you certain you are ready? She asked softly. I will not replace your wife. I will not erase your past. I do not want you to, he said. Eleanor will always be part of my life, but I cannot live only in memory. You have reminded me that I am still alive. Clara stepped closer. Marriage is not rescue, Alexander. It is partnership. I know, he replied, and I believe we could build something honest. Not rushed passion, not illusion. Something steady. Her breath trembled slightly. I care for you, she admitted. More than I expected. If you are certain that this is not gratitude or fear speaking, it is hope, he said firmly. She searched his eyes once more. Then she nodded. Yes, she said quietly. I will stay. Relief washed over him so strongly he nearly lost his breath. He reached for her hand. She let him take it. Clara, he said softly. Alexander. For the first time in 5 years, he felt the future open before him. And in the fading light, beneath the quiet sky, Blackthorn Manor felt less like a house of shadows and more like a home waiting to live again. The days after Clara agreed to stay passed with a strange mix of calm and excitement. Blackthorn Manor no longer felt silent and heavy. It felt awake. Alexander moved through the halls with new purpose. Fires were lit in rooms that had long stood cold. Curtains were opened to let sunlight pour across the stone floors. Even the servants seemed lighter in step, as if the house itself had exhaled after holding its breath for years. Clara did not try to take over. She simply began. She walked through the gardens each morning with gloves on her hands, studying the overgrown paths and broken trellises. She spoke with the groundskeeper about soil and seasons. She asked about the fountain and whether it could run again. "It can," the old groundskeeper told her. "It just needs care." "So does everything," she answered gently. Alexander watched her from the library window one afternoon as she knelt beside the wild roses. Her dress was simple. Her hair was tied back. She did not look like a duchess from a grand city. She looked like a woman who belonged to the land. That evening, he joined her outside. "You are not afraid of hard work," he said. She smiled. "I grew up with little help. Hard work does not frighten me. Living without purpose does." He understood that too well. They decided on a small wedding in the chapel near the estate. There would be no grand society event, no distant relatives eager for gossip, only close neighbors, trusted workers, and a few friends from Denver. Some people talked, of course. They always did. What a powerful duke marrying a woman of modest means after only weeks of acquaintance caused whispers. Clara heard them. "Does it trouble you?" Alexander asked one night, as they sat near the fire. "No," she said calmly. "People speak when they do not understand. We understand." The night before the wedding, Mrs. Whitaker brought Clara a small velvet box. "From His Grace," she said with a knowing smile. Clara opened it carefully. Inside rested a delicate necklace of pearls and blue stones. "It belonged to his mother," Mrs. Whitaker explained. "He said you should wear it tomorrow." Tears filled Clara's eyes, not because of its value, but because of what it meant. Acceptance. Belonging. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and golden. The wind had calmed. The sky stretched wide and blue above the Colorado hills. Alexander stood in his dressing room, adjusting his tie for the third time. He caught sight of himself in the mirror. The scar was still there. But the haunted look in his eyes had softened. He no longer looked like a man trapped in yesterday. He looked like a man stepping into tomorrow. When the chapel doors opened and Clara appeared at the entrance, his breath left him. She wore a simple ivory gown. The pearl necklace rested gently at her throat. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows and touched her hair with warmth. She walked toward him with steady steps. No father gave her away. No brother stood beside her. Yet she did not look alone. She looked certain. When she reached him, she smiled softly. "You look nervous," she whispered. "I am," he admitted. "So am I," she said gently. When the minister spoke of commitment, of choosing one another not only in happiness, but in hardship, of building something strong through trust and respect. When Alexander spoke his vows, his voice did not shake. "I take you, Clara, to walk beside me through whatever life brings, to honor your strength, to respect your mind, to build a home with you, not of stone, but of trust." Clara's eyes shone as she answered, "I take you, Alexander, not as a rescuer, but as a partner. I promise to stand beside you in grief and in joy, to remind you of light when shadows fall." When they exchanged rings, the chapel felt warmer. "You may kiss your bride," the minister said with a smile. Alexander leaned forward gently. The kiss was not rushed. It was steady, certain. Applause filled the small chapel. The workers who had once watched their duke withdraw into silence now smiled openly. Mrs. Whitaker wiped tears from her cheeks. Blackthorn Manor was not silent that afternoon. Laughter echoed through the halls during the wedding meal. Glasses were raised. Toasts were made. "To the Duke and Duchess of Blackthorn," one neighbor called out. "May this house never know such silence again." Later, as the guests departed and quiet returned, Alexander and Clara stood alone in the garden near the fountain. Water flowed once more. The fountain had been repaired the week before the wedding. It now sparkled in the fading sunlight. "It sounds alive," Clara said softly. "So do we," Alexander replied. 2 years later, the manor was unrecognizable. The gardens bloomed again, not as they once had, but fuller, wilder, alive. Yet children's laughter could now be heard from the east wing of the house. A nursery had been prepared, and in that nursery, Clara sat in a rocking chair, holding their infant daughter, Lily. Sunlight poured through the wide windows. The air smelled faintly of fresh flowers from the garden. Alexander stood in the doorway, watching them. At 36, he looked younger than he had at 34. Not because the scar had faded, it had not, but because peace had settled into his features. "She looks like you," Clara said softly. "I hope she has your courage," he answered. He crossed the room and gently touched his daughter's small hand. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Answering my letter?" Clara looked up at him with steady warmth. "Never," she said. "I came seeking stability. I found love. I stayed because I saw a man worth building a life with, and I was right." Alexander bent and kissed her forehead. He had once believed Blackthorn Manor carried a curse. Loss had followed him like a shadow. But now he understood something simple. The house had not been cursed. It had been waiting for someone brave enough to walk through its doors and stay. He had sought a wife through letters, expecting practicality and quiet companionship. Instead, he had found renewal. He had found laughter where silence once ruled, light where shadows once clung, a family where loneliness had lived. And in the restored gardens of Blackthorn Manor, where old roses bloomed beside new plantings, the past and present stood together without pain. Not erased, but healed. Because sometimes, when others flee from darkness, it takes only one brave heart to remain, and staying can change everything.